And I wear my ring.
Good morning. I'm Eileen Ullman. I am director of the JCC Chicago Jewish Film Festival, and it's my pleasure this morning to welcome the producers of the film Finding Manny. We have with us today Cindy Drucker and Jan Jekielek. I hope I said that right, Jan, who are not only the producers of this film, but also lovingly made this film as the daughter and son-in-law of Manny Drucker. And as I was coming on this morning, I learned that Manny has passed away recently. And, we just want to give you both our sincere feelings of sympathy and support, and what a legacy you made for your father and what a legacy for your family. So, may his memory be for a blessing.
Thank you. Thank
you. Wow, this was such an interesting film. Manny is such an interesting person. Before we got on, we were talking about his worldview and his sense of optimism and that will to just kind of push through and get beyond is really, it's an inspiration. And so let me just ask you, I know that your father went back to Poland, right, in the 90s, and he wrote a book, right? And the book was Carved in Stone, A Boy's Tale of the War Years. And I know that came out of it came from a quote, right, from Primo Levi.
Yeah. Do you want me to explain that?
Yeah, could you?
So one of there were several things that prompted him going to Poland at that time, but one of them was an author he read a lot and admired was Primo Levi, who's a Holocaust survivor, Italian Holocaust survivor, and he committed suicide very, very late in life. And that really affected my dad. And there's a quote that he says from one of his books. This isn't exactly the exact words, but basically he says there's two groups of Holocaust survivors: those who repress it, on whole, and those for whom it's as if carved in stone. Memories are as if carved in stone. And obviously he sees himself in that camp, and that's hence the title of the book. And which is interesting because, as it kind of comes out in the movie, he didn't talk about it, much growing up. So, but to know that it is so carved in stone and so with him all the time, that's pretty profound.
Absolutely. So tell me what, 30 years later or 20 years, well, about 30 years later, you decide to make a film about it and to go back and to go with your father and you start out talking about a shoebox full of photos, and those photos are pretty amazing. So how did a young boy, 17 years old, end up with those photos, and how did they make it all the way to Toronto?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. So all those photos are from directly after the war. So most of them are from the time in the orphanage. So and his immediate aftermath of the war, like the farmer that first, helped him. There's like a photo taken in the field, after he still has his head shaved and his arm is his prisoner clothes still, even though they've given him new clothes. And then at the orphanage that he eventually gets to. And so I guess they had cameras and they became, thick friends. They'd all been through this. The war is over, and they had a camera. So they took lots of photos, and he doesn't even remember exactly how they were developed and distributed, like how all that happened, but he's got those. But then there's some photos of the camps, right? In that patch. And what those were from, it's kind of shocking. So some entrepreneurial soldiers, I think, American soldiers, immediately after liberation, took photographs, I think it was in Buchenwald, of like bodies and, you know, the horrors of it. And some of those photos are like staged where they're like dragging a body, you know, with clamps from the skull. That's actually, and putting one into an oven because all that had ended. But they wanted to take these photos. So they took these photos and then they were selling them as bundles by the side of the road. Like, imagine this is just like post-war Europe. Everything's, you know, you can just imagine what cast. So they're entrepreneurial, took these photos, they're selling them as bundles by the side of the road. And my father bought them. Like, that was actually the most amazing part. And my sister and I actually see us reacting to that in the film. It's like, what? I'm flabbergasted that these exist and that he bought them and he has them. And he was just very matter of fact about it. It was
and he didn't share those photos with you and your siblings?
You know, there are these two or three cigar boxes, and there were some things we had seen, and I don't recall ever seeing those. I know we had seen some of the ones at the orphanage and stuff, but a lot of them were new. You even hear my mom saying, you know, I don't think I've seen these before. Hadn't seen a lot of the paperwork. So yeah, somehow because he didn't talk about, you know, the war and his time. And so it wasn't like, you know, here it all is, everyone. And, you know, when he came over, those were probably his pretty much only possessions. He, you know, whatever he acquired while he was at that orphanage would have been the only things he had. So yeah, he never pulled them out. It wasn't like objects of discussion that we knew about. It was, and so it came out because, as you see in the film, there was this article in the Smithsonian that my brother saw that was about the orphanage. He sent it around, and that kind of prompted everything. So he's like, oh, I've got this box of photos. And we're like, fascinating, really. And this is how the film, we never intended to make a film. So this is how things got rolling, is he talked about this box, and my sister and I were about to go to Toronto. It was Pesach. And so we were about to go. So we're like, don't open the box yet. Wait till we're there. We want to see it. And I knew like stories would come flooding out, you know, because he didn't talk about it much. So I wanted to capture it. So I was, you know, quite happy to capture it on my iPhone. But Casey, who Jan had worked with more closely, and I already knew as our director, I just called him up and explained the situation, said, do you have time to come over with a better camera? Like, just to capture this moment. That was how the whole thing started.
That's amazing. That is amazing. So you were going to just do it on your phone.
Yeah.
But thankfully,
yeah,
Casey came in and made the film, because like I said, it's a true legacy for your family, you know, and for generations to come. I mean, your family, they're strong. I mean, you have great genes. Like, you know, the fact that they went into hiding and they were able to stay in hiding for so long, you know, kind of in plain sight, you know, when you think about it. And then the fact that your grandmother and your aunt also survived, you know, in Auschwitz, like truly amazing. Yeah. What did they do in Auschwitz? And, you know, like, did they ever talk about it? I know your father didn't talk about it. Did you know your grandmother?
Yeah. She died when I was 15. So I knew her quite well.
Yeah.
But she mostly spoke Yiddish, not tons of English. No, they never talked about it. They talked about it even less. Like when my father and my mom went in 91 to Poland the first time, as you mentioned, you know, his sister didn't want to know anything about it. And, you know, other subsequent, you know, trips, and she didn't want to know anything about it. She thought it was, yeah. So she is in the first Primo Levi category. Yes. For sure. And, you know, I think his mother as well. I didn't even know until after she died that she, like, of course I should have assumed, but never thought about it and never saw it, that of course she would have had a tattoo, but she always wore long sleeves, even in the, you know, heat of summer. And I also learned after my aunt died, which was just a few years ago, that she had nightmares her whole life. Her daughter, my cousin, you know, I didn't know that either. So no, they completely didn't talk about it. So I don't know a lot about, I know a few little stories from Auschwitz. Like only my grandmother was there. So my aunt, she was sent to Ravensbrück, and then like, so it was just my grandmother was in Auschwitz, and she survived, I think it was 9 months there, which is unheard of. I know like one story, like she was saving up for days, morsels of bread to be able to trade for a sweater. This was winter and very cold. And then just as she had enough to trade, the bread was stolen. So she was without the bread and without the sweater. That's pretty much the only story we know.
How did they make their way? I mean, the whole story it's always amazing to me, like you survive the camps, and then somehow he gets to this orphanage, and you had to be proactive to fend for yourself. It wasn't like the war was over and everything was wonderful. No, it was not. And how did he find your grandmother and your sister and your aunt, and how did they get to Canada?
So my grandmother was one of 13 children. One of her sisters had gone to Canada before the war. So she was in Toronto. So that's ultimately why they were in Canada. But at the end of the war, when he was in the orphanage, it was very near Munich. And he went into Munich one day, check out the city, and encountered some people he knew from the camps, and someone knew his mother, and that's how he found out she was alive. I think and found out his mother and sister were both alive. They had been at some other refugee camp or something. But they had already left. They were moved from where they were in maybe it was Ravensbrück, both of them by the end of it, anyway, to Sweden. So they ended up getting to Canada through Sweden. So they had already left, but that's when he found out they were alive, and then tried, through, the Red Cross kind of thing to
Right.
send letters and connect and, get connected with them. But that's why they ended up in Toronto. He ended up in New York because actually a Jewish army sergeant that he had kind of connected with this army unit on his way to finding the orphanage, helped kind of sponsor him and connected him with like cousins, cousins he didn't know anything about in New York. And so that's how he ended up going to New York, through the sponsorship of this army sergeant.
Wow, it's a great story. And your father was went on to be a very successful guy, right? He did
serial entrepreneur. He
right?
did many businesses. He was always, this was the thing, his ethos became he needed to challenge himself. He wrote later, he actually has a second memoir that's unpublished, but he wrote later that he felt that he needed to do something. I can't remember exactly what he wrote, but basically he needed to do something extraordinary to make up for lost time. So he was always trying to, challenge himself and do something, but his motivation wasn't money or success. His motivation was overcoming challenges.
Maybe that's how he, kept whatever emotions kind of at bay. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? You're busy and you're focused on something over, right?
I think you're right. Yeah.
Right. That's, so your trip, what a fabulous trip to take with your family, with siblings and your parents, and to have that opportunity. And Jan, your ability to speak so many languages and really to understand. Can you talk, Jan, about it? What is your background and why do you know all those languages? And how,
well, I don't know if I know that many languages, but Polish I know, fluently, because my parents escaped from communist Poland in the 70s, and through France actually, and then ended up in Canada, and I was kind of born on arrival, right? And my mother, as brilliant as she is, languages were never her strong suit, so I learned Polish as a first language. And then I was a Boy Scout as well in Polish. So, I was involved in the Polish community. But no, it's also very interesting because, see, as a Gentile Pole, for most Poles, at least in my experience, there's this fascination with the Jewish people because they were such a central part, an important part of Polish life for so many centuries, right? For a really very long time, ever since, they kind of, Poland became this kind of haven for Jews, right? In Europe. And so, but it's kind of a historical, after the Holocaust, of course, people were either killed by the Nazis or left subsequently, right? And so, and there's these museums, there's sort of there's very few functioning synagogues. So there's this interest in this history that's, very, very robust for anyone that studies, Polish history. You see, the Jewish people being a very important part of that. But now it's like this historical thing. And how can you access that? And so actually what had happened was, Cindy gave me her father's book when we were getting to know each other. And this was actually before, it was really kind of a, let's say, a romantic relationship.
Mhm.
And I was so fascinated by his book because he talked about the war years, and also during the time when he was writing the book, it was just after 1989. So the Iron Curtain had lifted and Poland was opening up, and Manny was also fascinated with this. So he wrote kind of one chapter, the opening up in Poland, the next chapter, the war years, the Holocaust, right? And for me, this book had everything. It was the most incredible thing, right? And he also writes in this very dispassionate way, where you can tell he's not embellishing anything. He's just telling you how he saw it, and you feel the truth of it. You feel, okay, this is what really happened. So I had this idea. Cindy was working on the other side of the world at the time, and I said, listen, I've just been reading your book. It's incredible, your father's book. Why don't you come to Poland, and we'll use your father's book as a guidebook, and you can visit these places. And of course, Cindy being in Bali at the time, and me inviting her to Poland in the winter, it was the perfect place, the obvious thing to do. I'm just joking, but no, I think the fact that she would be able to have a Polish speaking guide through all this was, exciting to her. And on our trip, we kind of fell in love on that trip, sort of following her father's books. So Manny is actually very, very important, in many ways in my life as well, as kind of being maybe the linchpin that kind of caused this wonderful relationship I got to be in now for 20 years plus.
This is such a great story. That's a beautiful story that you just shared.
I joke that he used me to get to Manny.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Finding Manny, the title. So, as I watched the film, the first time I thought, well, it's Anna finding Manny. And then I thought about the family, like really understanding who your father was, because, as children, we experience what we experience, but, when you look back on it, you realize that you didn't know so much about your father. There's a lot of unknown. And so I wonder, where did you get the title from, and who was finding who? Like who found who? And and what was your intention behind it?
Well, to be honest, there's lots of throwing around different things. Finding Manny kind of became a placeholder, wondering if we could come up with something better, but that was the one that stuck. But I think there's so many levels of it, exactly the ones you mentioned. It's certainly Anna finding Manny, us finding him finding himself. If you think about it, he went to Poland in the early 90s, but he didn't go to Germany. And
Right.
You see, initially he didn't want to make the trip. He was completely, uninterested, and we weren't going to push him. I'm not going to push the old man to go face his demons, but he, eventually came around to it, himself, and decided he wanted to go. So I think there's a lot of finding. We found, a lot of, truth of things. We learned a lot of different things along the way. You saw one of them about, all the camps in Leipzig. And I think, to me, one of the most poignant lines in the whole film is him saying, I didn't realize there were so many camps. We thought we were the only ones, which is like, there's 700 camps in Leipzig alone, and they thought they were the only ones. And just, I don't know, somehow that always really, really strikes me. So I think the title stuck because it did express, so many different things.
Just on that point, we also discovered while we were at Buchenwald that he had been in something called the small camp in Buchenwald, which was actually known to be the worst part of Buchenwald, but isolated as well. And similarly, he had no idea that Buchenwald was so big and expansive because he was confined in this the so-called small camp. So it was very hard to kind of see the bigger picture when you were in the, this horrific system.
He also thought he had been sent to the next camp to replace the dead, but he realized on this trip that actually they were trying to alleviate conditions, these really, really, and it was the worst time for that small camp in the war. Like it was, when it was the most overcrowded, the most, just most diseased, the worst conditions. So they were trying to alleviate it. And that's why he got sent to the satellite camp. It wasn't to replace the dead.
It was shocking to me also. Like I didn't realize that there were 700 camps there, but when he was there, I mean, like just day-to-day survival, like that's all that I can imagine people could think about, just getting through the day to the next day. And so, that's why I love the title. Like I said, I watched it in one way the first time I watched it. Second time I watched it, I thought about it differently. I watched the film 3 times. I watch every film that we show 3 times typically.
Wow.
And because the first time you're watching it a film is submitted and you want to see, what it's about. And then I watch it again before like a final selection. And then afterwards, before I would interview you. So, I thought it was a great title. I was happy that you didn't use the title of your father's book. I felt like his book stands on its own. And this is like the next chapter and kind of, because it also includes you and your siblings. And I think some children or nephews and nieces also went. How many people actually went on the journey?
There was 9 family members and 2 film crew. So there was parents and the 4 kids, the son-in-law, and 2 of the grandkids. So my brother's has 5 kids, so his number 2 child, and Lori's 1 son, and there's another daughter who was a little thing at the time. So there's 7 grandkids, so 2 of them.
And how do your nieces and nephews, like how did the grandchildren feel about this?
The ones who went, or in general?
The ones who went obviously had a firsthand experience, which I would assume would be very powerful. But there is this legacy for all of the grandchildren, those who went and those who didn't. How have they, like, how did the trip affect those children who went, but also those children who didn't go?
I'm not totally sure. I mean, everyone has been very, fascinated by the film, and it's obviously a big family, talking point, focal point. So yeah, I don't know. I know, like, for the ones who went, and certainly the others too. I mean, they, when you have your grandfather, your Zeta, he's just this, old nice guy who's, nice to all that. You don't think of them as a person with this long history, right?
Right.
So I think that's what, they obviously got it and probably understood their own parents differently after that. But I think, yeah, just that insight to being able to see him as, like Leia says in the film, it was so cute. But anyway, going to see his, we walked down the street, his walk to school every day.
Yes.
And, the street where his school was. And he was telling us stories about, this cat he had. One day the teacher sent him home to get her cat, and the cat ran away when he was trying to bring her back, and he was mortified and trying to get the cat, this whole story, he's telling us.
Which a child could relate to.
Exactly. So, yeah, I think it's that seeing, understanding that whole history, and, it's of course our history, their history. So yeah, I don't know that I can share much more than that because I'm not in their heads, but.
I felt like the grandson who was interviewed on the screen I felt like it was mini Manny, not so much the looks, but you could hear Manny's voice in his voice. And so like another generation, another generation. It was Susan Stauber wrote in the chat, I don't know if you saw, but she said she actually is one of our like primo committee people. She watches every film with us and helps us to choose film. And she said that out of all the films, this was one of the top 10 for her. So, I mean, she was so touched by it. And I think it's because the warmth of the family and the family the family connection really shines through in your film. I wondered, did your mother know, like, did your mother know some of these stories? Did your father talk about his experiences with your mother?
I think she knew about, so she was with him in Poland to write that book and experience. And actually she jokes that she was a writer because he hand wrote everything and she typed it in, and it was the first level of
Oh
editing.
my gosh.
Yeah. So yeah, so she learned, I think she learned most of it through that process. She, as you know, she said he didn't talk about it much. She probably knew, I guess, a bit more than we did, maybe. Actually, we learned on the trip that us kids had been told different things at different points. Like my brother, I didn't know, my dad would tell him like bedtime stories, just, the fun anecdotes of how he figured something out and arranged something, not the horrific stuff. But, we didn't get those. And we're like, really? He told you those? I had no idea. So, there were things that we discovered. So I'm sure there's some things my mom knew maybe that we didn't, but it was never anything. If he was in the mood, he would share something, but it was never anything we asked about. We didn't feel like we should or wanted to, or, so we just kind of accepted it when he, dropped things. But that was it. So yeah, I think on the first trip to write the book.
And sometimes he would tell jokes, which no one knew how to respond to. Like when the kids, I love this story, but the kids would come back from camp and be talking about all the cool things they did. And he'd say something like, I don't think we had that at camp.
No, he said, this is the line, or one of the lines. He said, I went to camp once. I didn't like it much. We slept 8 to a bed. Do with that.
Well, he was trying to relate. He was trying to relate. I mean, I think, what we've observed through the film festival is that where often survivors did not talk about their experiences with their children, they did somewhat open up with grandchildren. And so in many cases, a lot of the films that we're watching today are being made by the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. It's very interesting. My own in-laws, they were survivors, and they really didn't talk much about it with their children. They did talk about it with me, and they talked about it with my children. So, I don't know why that was, that they felt more comfortable or opened up with a grandchild. Maybe the passage of time. It's hard to know.
I wonder, I have 2 thoughts about that. It could be the sense of, okay, I need to let this be known, while I still have a chance. But also maybe, in the film, he's sharing this with Anna when we first meet in the lobby of the hotel. And he's saying he didn't want to burden us. He was actively didn't talk to us about it because he didn't want to burden us with it, didn't want it to affect us. And of course, he did affect us somehow, obviously. So maybe it's that sort of awareness that you're raising this generation and you don't want to affect them negatively or burden them with that, or put whatever might be in their heads would be the impact of talking about it. Maybe just a thought.
Well, in the same way that like what's in the frame and what's out of the frame, sometimes what you don't see in the frame of a film is very telling. Sometimes the not talking about something is also very telling too. So maybe that's it. Yeah. It's hard to know. It's hard to know. Was it, somebody asked, is this the first time you ever made a film?
Yes.
Well, it was very, you did a great job. Would you?
Well, we had Casey, and I think, you know, this was actually a very, very important part, if I can. You know, Casey had done some amazing fly on the wall documentary work before. He had made this short film called The Crown, which I thought was very powerful. You know, super briefly, it was the story of Miss World Canada, okay, who had campaigned to become this beauty queen on a platform of human rights in China. And guess where the final was? The final was in China. So she got denied entry, right? So it created this whole, you know, international incident. And Casey himself grabbed his camera and was, hey, can I hang out with you while you try to get in through Hong Kong? You know, back then Hong Kong was still free and so forth. So anyway, it was an amazing little film. And so it was just very natural for him to step into this as a kind of fly on the wall documentarian. You know, inadvertently, because he had come with, you know, with his camera just to film some of these family events, and then a whole series of events just kind of happened. It was, you know, as Frida says in the film, it was beschert, right?
Right.
There's so many things that were basically make us think that it was destiny or fate that this happened, because it was kind of a miracle, even just sort of how all the different pieces came together to be able to make this film.
It really is. Now, did you know Casey prior to this? He was a friend. He was a family friend.
We knew each other. We knew each other very well. Yeah, he's a close friend of mine.
Well, we're going to look for future films from Casey for sure. For
Yeah.
sure. There was a question about your brother. So clearly your brother is religious. And the question was, do you think that your father's experience had influence on that? Because it's clear that some of the family is more secular and some of it more religious. And it's always interesting to think about what inspires that.
I think I would say, like, no, from a religious point of view. I mean, he's the only one that, you know, he's Lubavitch. It was later in life that he, you know, became Lubavitch. And so definitely my father is not, but certainly part of the, you know, you see it in the film. He talks about repudiating the Holocaust as, you know, having kids, living religious life, being, you know, proud Jews kind of thing. So I would say probably the Holocaust experience, his father certainly, you know, being directly, you know, involved in that. I think it was interesting, you know, he said that the thinking about all the relatives that were never born, you know, my grandmother was one of 13 kids, and, you know, there's a lot of family lines stopped and a lot of, you know, family that never existed.
Yes.
And he talks about, you know, that's a lot to live up to. So I think it affected him in that sense, certainly.
Absolutely. And so how many kids does he have?
He has 5. He started a little later in life. Started a little late.
It's okay. He's doing his job. Well, your film, such a warm and loving story, and such a beautiful legacy. And you should be proud. And you know, we send all of your family our best wishes and our sincere sympathy. And but your father, he should just be for a blessing. And you should all just be well and continue to thrive.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I wish you both a wonderful rest of your day. And please send our regards to your mom.
I shall.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
The recording over.
Hi.